The AI apocalypse is coming for India's IT service sector. Will India be able to leverage the US-China trade war and rapidly grow its manufacturing and industrial sector before it too is wiped out by the coming AI robotics revolution? Wage arbitrage may be rapidly becoming a thing of the past as AI and robotics drives the cost of labor to zero. White-collar office work, the very IT jobs that have powered India's growth, will be the first professions to fall as AI and automation change the global economic landscape. For India's future, time will tell. But in this video, we'll explore India's future growth trajectory while also returning to the past, to the fateful years of the 1990s, when the powers that be decided the fates of India and China. And in 2025, it is becoming increasingly obvious that India, along with the West, are losing in the face of China's growing dominance. In the years following the fall of the Soviet Union, Western political and business leaders were busy architecting the new free trade future of globalism, one that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Their primary instrument for enriching themselves at the expense of the citizens that they claimed to represent was simple: wage arbitrage, or in simpler terms, outsourcing and the exploitation of cheaper foreign labor. If we think about labor, it can be divided into two categories: manual labor and cognitive labor. Manual labor is generally the type found in factories, construction, and manufacturing settings. Cognitive labor, on the other hand, is typically found in the office park. The manual laborer or manufacturing technician works in a factory, building things, while the cognitive worker labors at a desk under the glow of fluorescent lights, typing away at a keyboard, manipulating bits. In terms of economic metrics, manual labor generally shows up as manufacturing value added and the export of physical goods, whereas cognitive labor shows up as services or service exports. If we examine service exports as a percentage of GDP, we can see that India's dependence on service exports is around 5 times higher than China's, with much of this coming from the IT sector. Back in the 90s, the decision had to be made between the two Asian giants, China and India. Who would do what? Western leaders, then, were confronted with a choice. Should they pursue a balanced approach to wage arbitrage and outsourcing, or would they pursue a path of specialization, one that would maximize their future wealth at the expense of geopolitical stability and national security? Of course, they chose the path of specialization. Their greed was more important than engineering geopolitical stability, and national security, it turns out, just means making the right people the maximum amount of money. Effectively, the decision was made that China would specialize in manufacturing, industry, and in the realm of physical world manual labor, and India, on the other hand, would specialize in cognitive labor and the service sector, most especially information technology or IT. Perhaps China's emerging totalitarian state-controlled capitalism was deemed most likely to maximize the wealth of the Western elites, whereas India's democratic system was viewed as too inefficient and chaotic. The general proficiency for English within the educated portions of India's population would have also encouraged India's specialization in the service sector. And then there's the geopolitical legacy. The engineered Soviet-Sino split and China's economic opening in the early 1980s likely saw increased collusion and scheming between Western and Chinese elites. India, in contrast, its constant flirtation with the Soviet Union and socialism during the Cold War, and its continued close ties with post-Soviet Russia possibly mark them for punishment. But of course, we can only speculate. Next, we'll look at how this decision impacted foreign direct investment from the West. As everyone knows, building things in the real world takes a lot more money and resources than merely constructing things in the digital space. If we examine foreign direct investment, or FDI, that flowed into China and India after the Soviet collapse, we can see the massive difference in the magnitude of foreign direct investment that flowed into the two Asian giants. If we look at the ratio of FDI received by China versus India, we can see that China routinely received 5, 10, or even 50 times more FDI than India in the 1990s and the 2000s. And not only did a massive amount of Western investment cash flood China, but the West also transferred its critical technologies and intellectual property to Beijing. Fast forward to 2025, and China has begun to rival or even greatly exceed the US and Europe for high-tech, high-value manufactured products like solar cells, batteries, and semiconductors. India, not so much. In fact, India has one of the worst trade deficits with China, around 100 billion USD in 2022, and India is just as dependent as the US or Europe on China's world-class, world-dominating industrial sector. If we examine the cumulative FDI received by China and India in between the years 2000 and 2023, we can see that China received around $4 trillion in FDI, almost 6 times higher than the meager $700 billion received by India. India's infrastructure also greatly lags China. China was able to use that Western investment cash to not only become the global giant of industry, but also a global giant in both civil and industrial infrastructure. And then we come to AI. Because of its digital nature, the AI freight train is rapidly decimating job opportunities in the cognitive labor office worker space. India's specialized role as the preferred destination for outsourced IT work and customer service functionality will come under rapid threat as Western companies increasingly switch to AI. The wage arbitrage that India has enjoyed in the service sector will soon come to an end. Although AI, coupled with advanced humanoid robotics, will eventually erase the advantage of wage arbitrage in the physical labor manufacturing space, that will take more time. And China, already having grown to dominate almost every sector of industrial manufacturing, will be able to cash in on that AI and robotics revolution. India, once again, will likely be left far behind. But there is still a sliver of hope for India, and that sliver of hope is the US-China trade war. It could be India's last chance to draw massive foreign direct investment, technology, and IP transfers from the West, and to finally build the infrastructure necessary to challenge China's industrial dominance. And of course, demographically, India is at a tremendous advantage. With a median age around 10 years younger than the rapidly aging China, and its still very high proportion of low productivity rural agricultural workers, India could supercharge its growth in the coming decades. If India can shift its vast agricultural workforce to higher value producing manufacturing, it could also go a long way to erasing rural poverty and the low levels of infrastructure development in India's countryside. In the first iteration of the trade war, circa 2018, we can see that Mexico was able to supercharge its growth in manufacturing value added in GDP. For Mexico, it saw its MVA growth rate increase by a factor of 4.6 in between 2019 and 2023. India, however, only posted an increase of 1.1. As a cautionary note, however, we can point out that a significant portion of Mexico's apparent boost in exports to the U.S. was due to its facilitating transshipments from China in order to bypass U.S. trade and tariff restrictions. If India can avoid merely becoming a transshipping point for Chinese goods, it can potentially experience massive growth in its manufacturing and industrial sector in the coming years and tap into America's still dominant consumer market, around 31% of the global consumer market in 2023. And finally, we could see a rebalancing of the China-India MVA ratio, one that has seen China outpace India's MVA by a factor of 10 since around 2013. If we look at India's MVA growth in isolation, we could come to the conclusion that India has experienced solid growth in its manufacturing and industrial sectors. However, if we put it into perspective with China, we can see that it is actually quite dismal. And of course, a growing industrial sector would pay dividends for India's lagging GDP growth. If we look at the relationship between MVA and GDP, we can see that China and Mexico have largely powered their GDP growth with manufacturing. For China and Mexico, around 25% of their GDP comes from MVA, whereas India lags far behind with only around 13%. And another positive sign for India's potential competitiveness is its still very low gross national income, around 5 to 6 times lower than China or Mexico. The lower wages in India would allow it to compete with countries like China and Mexico, despite lagging behind in industrial and human capital development. If we turn to import-export data, we can see that Mexico's exports to the U.S. rose dramatically in the wake of the 2018 trade war. If India can get in on the action in Trade War Part 2, then India could finally begin making grounds on its enormous neighbor, China. But time will tell. It is hard to say what exactly is going on with the trade war, whether it is merely a mirage or whether it will truly reshape the global system of trade is yet to be determined. But either way, time may be rapidly running out for India. AI automation will eventually hollow out India's IT service sector, and China, boosted by its growing technical dominance, will likely continue to dominate global industry and manufacturing. However, at least for the time being, we can still hope that India will have a chance to supercharge its growth before it's too late. Not only for the sake of the Indian people, but perhaps also for the sake of the entire Western world. China's strategy of slowly destroying Western industrial capacity and creating critical dependency, an operation that was facilitated by the West's greedy leadership classes, may just be the strategy that will end the West and solidify China's global dominance for decades to come. Whether we will live in a world dominated by democracy or totalitarianism is being decided at this very moment. If there ever was a time to put the past behind us, it is now. In the face of a growing existential threat from China, the US, Europe, and India must work together. It's either united we stand, or divided we fall. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and please consider liking the video, subscribing, or leaving a comment with your thoughts. Thanks again, and have a nice day or night.